And when we got to Birkenau, the trains went right into the camp.
I remember a lot of noise. It was noisy, dogs barking, people screaming.
He chose me, he asked me all kinds of questions about my health and how old I was. Of course, I said I was older.
And with a nod of a finger like this, they would decide who was to go to the right or the left. One side was to live and the other side was to die.
We were taken to the reception block where we had our head shaved and the number tattooed.
And he told me, you're here to be experimented on. So I didn't even know what that meant.
That day, I lost my mother, two younger brothers, one of 10 and one of 12, two grandmothers, numerous uncles and aunts and their families.
One brother, a sister, and my mum went to the gas chambers.
For us survivors, it's always there. We don't have to scream about it every day, but it's there. I mean, it's impossible not to be there.
I don't carry hate, but I can't forgive.
It must be remembered for future generations. And they must know what happened so that they can guard against developments of this nature.
Because it concerns everybody. It doesn't just concern Jews.
It can happen to my other race. It can happen to another nation.
Okay.
Overall.
Right. You better spell your name for me.
The name is Victor, V-I-C-T-O-R, Greenberg, which is G-R-E-E-N-B-E-R-G.
E-R-G.
E-R-G, yeah.
Okay. Right, well, I don't know, how does one begin an interview like this? I suppose the fact it's the anniversary coming up.
Yeah.
As someone who survived Auschwitz, what impact does an anniversary like this have on you? I mean,
the impact, now you have to remember, is 50 years ago this happened. In fact, more than that. From the time I went into the camp to Auschwitz, 51 years. The impact now, it brings back memories for a time when I came to Britain. And I think this, I can say, goes to for most of us. We try to forget about it. It's not the thing to say to forget about it, because it's impossible to forget. It's something which is embedded in us. You can't really forget, but we tried, because we tried to build up our lives. We were at a stage where we couldn't sink any lower, so we tried to build our lives up. And I'm pleased to say that most of us managed to do that, you know. Most of us became quite successful. Some, we have, for example, the person who was involved with the structural design of the center point in Tottenham Court Road was one of our survivors, a boy called Willie Frischman. And some succeeded in business, some became professional people, and overall we made quite a success of ourselves. But I have to say, since we brought up families, we were very busy with life, and you don't have much time to think about it. It's come home from work late, working long hours, have something to eat, watch the television, fall asleep in front of the television, and that's how life went on. And we were really involved in bringing up families. But now that I have more time, I think about it more. And of course, being the anniversary, and we see a lot of it. Last week there was a lot on television about the Shoah, the Holocaust. It brings back many memories. And we also give talks about it. And I have to say, I'm immune to it. I can talk now freely. I try not to get emotional. But when I finished the talk last Sunday I told you about, I came home, I didn't sleep very well, I have to tell you. It brings back memories, and horrific memories. And I told the people there, I said, I didn't want to go into the details of suffering, other than to say that it's unimaginable how much suffering a human body can endure. And it wasn't, you can't say that about mental suffering. I'll give you an example. People ask, how's it that I survived and others did not? And the answer, I think, is very simple. I was very young, inexperienced, naive, and didn't really absorb the seriousness and the hopelessness of it. I want to tell you, adjacent to my camp, which was called the Zigeunerlager. Zigeunerlager means gypsy camp. The reason they called it that because the gypsies were housed there. Sadly, they were annihilated as well, you know. But next to my camp, adjacent to that, was my father and two uncles who survived the initial selection. And the worst part really, and I suffered terribly through that, is to see them disintegrate. I had an uncle who was a huge man, you know, and within a couple of months he shriveled up to nothing. Imagine they had to live with the torment of knowing, thinking they brought up, struggled all their lives to bring up a family, and 200 yards away they were brutally murdered in gas chambers. How can a person like that survive mentally? It was impossible. When I left Auschwitz-Birkenau, it was in the autumn of 1944, which was 6 months before the war ended. None of them survived. I don't really know what happened. Conditions were terrible there, really. We were on a starvation diet, and we didn't always get that. But I say I don't really want to go into details.
That's understandable, but just so I understand fully, how many of your family were there that you left behind in 44?
Well, let me explain. I come from an area called the Carpathian Mountains. It's also known as Ruthenia. It's now is Ukraine. Before between the two world wars, it was ruled by the Czechs, and prior to that, it was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And I come from a very small place. The area was really situated. There were clusters of villages. In mine, there were 42 Jewish families, and about double that of Ukrainian Catholics, and also just a handful of Czech families who were doing the administration for the area. Now, what happened in 1939, when the war broke out, I was 10 years old. The Hungarians, who were allies of the Nazis, occupied the area. And that's when the troubles really started, the hostilities. The Ukrainians up till then had their own culture and separate schools, whereas the Jewish kids went to secular school with the Czech families' kids. And we had a very happy childhood, really, lots of love and care, and also bearing in mind it was a small community, everyone knew each other. And I got on very well with the Czech kids. I used to go to their homes, they came to ours. We had an excellent relationship. But when the Hungarians came in, they amalgamated the two schools. And the Jewish kids, as well as the secular studies, they had the Jewish studies, which are quite extensive. We put in lots of hours. And by the time they amalgamated the two schools, the Jewish children were well advanced in their studies. And I think that created a lot of jealousy. And also the Hungarian teachers, who were trying to impose Hungarian language on us. And it was all difficult they were siding with the Ukrainian children. And we had lots of problems, lots of fights. And the Jewish kids, although sometimes they even won physically, being in a minority, it wasn't always the case that the Ukrainians won. We always put up good fights. But the fact is that we couldn't win, because even if we won physically, we would be reprimanded by the teachers. If it was the other way around, that was okay. But I just cut it short and say, but under the Hungarian occupation, things were very, very difficult. They imposed a lot of restrictions. And this was up till 1941. The Hungarian authorities rounded up about 70% of the Jewish population of that area. And they loaded them up on army trucks and take them across to Poland, to a place called Kamenets-Podolsk, where they were massacred, all of them. They left some Jewish families behind because they were useful to their efforts, including mine, because my father was supplying the local army with meat, so they needed him. And this carried on until 1944, when we were taken to a small ghetto near the town which was called Hust, which was about 50 miles away from where I lived. And there we lived under very cramped, difficult conditions for 6 weeks. The first biggest shock was there because the Gestapo were then in charge already. They took over from the Hungarian authorities. And they always chose somebody who was prominent in the community to be a liaison officer. So they chose a Dr. Martin, who was the doctor in our area for many years. He was a very fine man, always looked after the community to the best of his ability. And after a couple of days, this Dr. Martin committed suicide, and that was a terrible shock. And I can only assume that they told him what was going to happen to us, and he probably couldn't take it. He was a man, you know, all his life looked after the people, and you know, he realized what was going to happen. That was the biggest shock. And then after the 6 weeks there, we marched to the railway line, and we were then loaded up onto these cattle trucks, really in terribly cramped conditions, without any facilities, without sanitary conditions, very little water, lack of air. The only windows, they had the small narrow windows up the top, which were also wired up with barbed wire, so people couldn't even put their head out to get some fresh air. And the journey to Auschwitz, Birkenau, took 4 nights and 4 days, and it wasn't very far, really, you know, across to Poland. That was a terrible journey. By the time we arrived, quite a number of people died, old elderly people. They couldn't survive. And when we got to Birkenau, the trains went right into the camp. And they opened the doors and they shouted, "Raus schnell," which means out quick. And believe me, we were only too glad to get out. And what happened is they told us to line up in a couple of lines, queues. And we were waiting to approach the selection committee, they had an area with 2 tables and a couple of SS officers sitting there, and with a nod of a finger like this, they would decide who was to go to the right or the left. One side was to live and the other side was to die. Now, I was in that queue, and I was saved by a couple of Jewish young men who were working on the railway line. They came up to me and said, one of them first of all came up and said, "Tell them you're 18. Don't forget, tell them you're 18. And then a little later, another one came up with the same thing, "Tell them you're 18, registered." When I came to the selection officers, they asked me my age, and I said 18. They looked at me and said, "Okay," and I was lucky to be alive. Now, on that day, I lost my mother, 2 younger brothers, one of 10 and one of 12, 2 grandmothers, numerous uncles and aunts and their families, most of my friends, and most of the people from the entire area in one day. And I found myself the next day in these gypsy camps, isolated. And I didn't discover till much later that my father was adjacent to me. And I used to talk to him from time to time there. But the terrible thing was to watch them disintegrate. By the time I left, the bones were already sticking out of skins. And that was Birkenau, Auschwitz for me. I arrived there in May '44, and I left in the autumn to another camp called Mauthausen in Austria. And from there I went to one called Gusen, which was the best of all because there I was working and I was more assured of getting my ration of food, even though it was minute, but at least I got it. And then I was liberated in a camp called Gunskirchen, which was near Linz, also not far from Mauthausen. And that was one, it was a temporary camp. Normally the barbed wires were electric, but this was not, and they had guards at intervals guarding us. But this camp was the worst, really. It was 3 weeks before liberation when we got into there. And there were no facilities, there was no sleeping places. And I still remember there was lots of rain and mud. And the worst was that there was a typhus epidemic that broke out, and people were dying like flies. I used to lay down, because by that time I was so weak that I was just dozing all the time, practically. I used to wake up and bodies all around me. People were just dying, and very few survived. And when I was liberated, I fell desperately ill with typhus as well. And I collapsed a couple of days after liberation. And the next thing I woke up in a hospital in Linz. And I was so weak I couldn't walk really. I had to crawl on my floor for a number of weeks until I gained enough strength.
Did you ever go back to Auschwitz afterwards?
I went back last year. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So I went to Poland with a couple of friends from here. In fact, it was a very large gathering from all over the world. Very impressive.
This was 1993, wasn't it?
93, and April 93. And I decided to go there. And one of the reasons was that I wanted to go back to Birkenau. I took one of my sons with me.
Not your wife?
No, just one of my sons. And we went. It was a very emotional experience, but I'm glad that I went because I feel a little lighter now that I did. It was a visit that I needed to make to pay tribute to my family who were brutally murdered there. And I met also a lot of people. I met, surprisingly, one or two people who were actually in the Mauthausen camp with me, and we exchanged views, and we all talked about what happened, and really it confirmed my views and my thoughts about the time, which was interesting.
Did you feel you needed to show your son?
Did I?
Did you feel you needed to show your son?
Well, my children, we have 2 sons and a daughter. They were always interested to know what happened. And I did tell them, even from a young age, I was careful not to tell them too much at the time, certainly not of the brutalities. It wasn't the case with most of my compatriots. They couldn't talk about it to their families at all. Some of them, to date, cannot talk about it. They find it difficult, they break down. But I managed to overcome it, and they very much wanted to come, but my oldest son had already made arrangements to go to a wedding to the States, a close friend of his. So my younger son came. And in fact, my oldest son is now organizing a trip to go to Poland, to the concentration camps. For next April, he's hoping that 40 people will go, 40 young people. So, yeah, that should be interesting to hear.
Just out of curiosity, because that was your first time back in '93, you talked to other people who'd survived. It must have been odd, your first sight of this place.
Well, let me explain. It was a week. Overall, it was a wonderful week because we had met a lot of people, and it was quite joyful most of the time. Of course, when we went to visit Treblinka the next day that we arrived, that was an awful experience. We said prayers there, they sang hymns, and Treblinka, if you go there, there's nothing left except a monument and lots of stones representing the different communities, different towns and villages, with the names written of it. Most of the people from Warsaw were murdered in Treblinka. And then I went to a colleague of mine who lives around the corner, whom I've known for many, many years. He comes from a place called Piotrków. And we went to his hometown, and I spent the whole day with him, which was very interesting. My son came as well, and he showed us where he lived in the area. And standing there in the square, which is really a beautiful square, and the houses were dilapidated, they needed a lot of attention. But I stood there in that square and I imagined it, what it was like when the Jewish people were there, hustle and bustle, trading and going around. And the place was empty, you know, it was like dead, hardly any life there at all. So I'm glad I went there, I saw it, and I imagined what it was like before. And then we went to Birkenau. And we were taken around by somebody who works in the Auschwitz museum. He was a curator, he's a curator. And the reason I went to see him, because in America, last year, the year before actually it happened, the revisionists got hold of a Jewish chap and they sent him to Auschwitz. He pretended that he wanted to find out what happened, and he spoke to this curator and he asked him whether he could go around with one of his assistants, and he did, and he took film of everything. When he came back, he spoke to the man and he said, was this here before or was it built after? And you know, some things were added on. And he said he took note of this and he took film of it. The result was, when he went back to America, they made a video and saying, how can you possibly believe of what happened when some of the things that we talked about were installed after the war ended? You know, so they were actually advertising and distributing this video. Now I went to speak to this man and to tell him that we might take action against that group. And the problem is you can't, because what he said was actually true, you know, that one or two things were added on. So, you know...
Does that matter?
Well, it matters in as much that some people believe it, you know, the revisionists. If they say, well, the gas chambers were not there and it never happened, and then they deny it. I mean, there's a man here in England called Irving. I don't know if you know about
David
him.
Irving, yeah.
David Irving, yeah. He is one of those who denies that gas chambers ever existed. So, at least now there's still some of us, although we are aging, and we are amongst the youngest of the survivors. We bore witness, and we went through it. We can at least explain. But comes a time when we're gone, and there's going to be controversy over this. I can imagine it.
You must think it's not.
So they said to me, you don't have to be tougher where you're going, but they couldn't stop us. There's only a few of us, you know, not many. certainly at the time that I went. So I forgot your question, actually.
Well,
How many?
Now too.
I was talking about how. Yeah, we lived in a hostel.
Yeah, it's just that simple bit. Eventually, when you sort of settled here,
Yeah.
you must. I assume there must be an awareness that you were a survivor. You would have known. I mean, just within the Jewish community alone, that everybody else who was a survivor, was there a sense? I mean, I was an Auschwitz survivor, and that here's another one, and you watched how each of you got on. Was there a community?
Well, what happens was this: we were in hostels. Eventually, and then we formed a Jewish youth club. It's called the Primus Jewish Youth Club. It's non-existent now. And this became a very successful club. We did lots of sports activities. And as I mentioned to you, Ben Helfgott became a British weightlifting champion. And we excelled in table tennis, we used to go there, a club. It was a very good social club for us. And we became very close, Eventually, most of us went away and left England. And this club carried on for a short time, and then we actually left. We outgrew it, so it continued for a little while with younger Jewish youth, but then it folded up. Now, after that, we formed a society called the 45-8 Society, which basically is for the purpose of meeting from time to time. We have a reunion each year, and we raise funds for charities. We felt that when we came to Britain, we were helped, so it's time we reciprocated. So we raised funds, and we raised in the region of about £10,000 each year, mostly on brochure advertising. And we distribute this to various charities. So we still have contact, and we all know each other. A few of us died by now, as you will imagine. Quite a few, in fact. But yeah, this reunion acts for that purpose, that we meet. And some of us keep in close touch socially, several little groups.
I bet, okay.
But
no. I'm just curious to know that how old were you at the time when you were in Auschwitz?
When I went to Birkenau, Auschwitz, I was 14.
And 15 when you left?
15 when, yes, actually, because I was born in August, so 15. And when the war ended, when I was liberated, I was 15.
So you return and see Auschwitz-Birkenau for the first time again in your early 60s?
Yes, I was 64 when I returned.
But just seeing the buildings, some of which remain, the site,
yes,
must have, I don't know.
Well, some of the buildings were destroyed, some of the barracks. Some of them were still there, and I walked through a couple. And it was exactly like I remembered it. They were filled up with about 2,000 people in each barrack. Basically, the gypsy camp, the Zigeunerlager, was a transit camp. From there, they did selections to send to working groups to working camps. But I didn't volunteer for selection. For one, my father was nearby, so I tried not to leave. So, because I used to call out appels, which means roll calls. I had these appels every day, but especially for people to be taken to work camps, and they selected the strong ones always. I'll tell you what you might find interesting. how I got out of there. In the autumn, my father said to me one day, he says, look, you've got to get out on the next working transport. If you don't, he says, I'll tell you straight, you're doomed. So what I did, they held this appel roll call, normally 5 in a row, and I stood on a large stone at the back to make myself look taller, because they only selected the strong ones. It didn't work. They discovered it and they pulled me out, and they really gave me hell. They formed a circle and they were throwing me about from one another. How old are you? And I said 18, and they kept on saying, no, you're not 18. And I said, yes, I am. And they were punching me and throwing me. You're not, tell the truth, you haven't even got pubic hair yet. How can you be 18? And anyway, after all that, they rejected me, and I found myself locked in a barrack with a guard standing outside to be taken to the gas chambers the following day, probably. I managed to escape after the second attempt. The barracks had narrow windows on top. I managed to get out with a colleague of mine who now lives in Israel. The problem was that by the time we got out, the transport that was to leave had already their numbers tattooed on their arms. And it was too late for us to have that done. So nevertheless, we queued up separately. I queued up to get, and he managed to get out as well. And when the transport was leaving, at the gates they had a couple of tables with the SS officers checking out the numbers. And I got in the queue, and I got nearby, and I was thinking, who shall I go to? Which one shall I select to go to? And I went to one who was an elderly man. He looked a little, he wasn't too much concerned about what was happening. And I walked up to him, and he said, Nummer, which means number. And I'm standing there helpless. So he looked up and says, Nummer. And I made a gesture, I haven't got one. And he looked at me and looked again, and said, okay, he let me through. And that's how I got out. And as we were walking to the railway lines, my father was standing and waiting to see if I managed to get out with lots of other people. And when he saw me, he started crying, and he didn't say a word. He just turned round and walked away. And that was the last I've seen of him. That's when we parted.
And that was 44.
That was autumn 44. I don't know the exact date, because dates were meaningless to us.
But it must have been, given that as your last memory of Auschwitz, seeing your father, who you'd never see again.
Yeah.
Going back must have brought all that back for you.
Well, of course it did. Not only did it bring it back, I lived with it. You know, I said earlier, we try to forget, but you can't really. Inside, it's in me all the time. I lived with this. I've talked about it. Yeah, it was painful, of course, because that was one of the most painful memories that I have, parting with my father. Sure.
Is it
when I went actually to the monuments there, I mean the gas chambers were of course blown up, and just the areas are there, and the crematoriums were blown up as well. But I was quite strong about it. I made up my mind not to get emotional, but my son cried bitterly when we got there. I went there and I said the prayer for the dead with my son. It's called Kaddish in the Jewish language. Very painful, of course.
Does one lay flowers?
No. No. No flowers.
We just say the prayer.
That's all. And slowly walk back. After visiting some of the barracks, and of course it brought back memories.
Will you go back next week for the 50th anniversary?
No, I have no intention of going back ever. I don't feel comfortable in Poland. There's been a lot of suffering under the Poles as well. There are a lot of collaborators. I'm speaking because I've heard it from my colleagues. Having said that, a lot of Poles have suffered terribly as well. A lot of them lost their lives and were murdered by the Nazis as well. But there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland. Even now, I have to tell you, the Jewish population was so depleted out of Europe, Eastern Europe, part of Russia, and on this side, Greece and Corfu. There was only about 4 to 5% who survived, and most of those were the young ones, up to the age of 30. The generation above us, very, very few survived. But Poland had the largest concentration of Jewish people before the war, 3.5 million. Do you know how many there are now in Poland? Have a guess. You don't know. 4,000 to 5,000 out of 3.5 million. And those are mainly old ones. But there still is anti-Semitism there. When we were there, we saw groups of youths shouting abuse at us. And being in the hotel, I'll tell you a little story. The last evening, we had our meal at the hotel. They served up some food. We were a group, so they served us separately. And the food was inedible. They set up some fish which was completely raw. And we complained about it. My colleague complained about it. And he made a remark, it tastes like rubbish. So the waitress, who was about 18, do you know what she said? She said, "No wonder you disliked all over the world." You see? Now, that was an 18-year-old girl who probably never seen any Jews, or probably if she did, she wouldn't know the difference anyway. And we don't all have horns on our heads, do we?
I sort of know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why do you think it's important that Auschwitz is remembered?
Auschwitz is the biggest cemetery in the world. Birkenau, Auschwitz, more than 2 million people were brutally murdered. It must be remembered. It must be remembered for future generations. And they must know what happened so that they can guard against developments of this nature. Let me tell you, the world hasn't learned a great deal. If you just take, for example, recently, Rwanda, the murders, the brutal murders that were taken there, took place there. So what has the world learned? I'll tell you what I've learned. I've learned this, that I love England. England has given me a new life, a life of freedom, and I've brought up a family here. And I'm quite a loyal citizen, and I feel safe here. And I feel that my children will be safe here, at least for a while. But you never know what life brings. Given the right conditions, bad economical situations, and that's how it developed in Germany, because the Germans were such a low that they believed Hitler. He said the Jews were the cause of the depression. Given such conditions, it can happen anywhere in the world. And I feel that the security for me is really Israel, because I feel had there been an Israel before the Second World War, this probably wouldn't have happened. So yes, I feel it's important that for the Jews to have a strong Israel, because Israel's doors are open for any Jew who's suffering hardship or oppression.
Can I ask you about this? Do we know how many Auschwitz survivors there are here in Britain?
Auschwitz survivors, I don't know, but I can tell you approximately how many survivors, camp survivors, here. And I'll tell you how this came about. When the war ended in 1945, the Jewish community got permission from the British Foreign Office to bring over 1,000 youngsters up to the age of 16 to settle here. They could find no more than 732. Now, they came in different groups. I was one of the last. They started coming in August 45. I was one of the last, and I landed in Northern Ireland on a farm called Mill Isle, which is near Donaghadee. And that was February 46. Now, out of that 732, the vast majority, dispersed worldwide. A lot of them went to America, where they found relatives, to Canada. Quite a number went to Israel. And only about 100 stayed behind in this country. And we have reunions every year. Some live in Manchester, but the majority in London. So we have a reunion, and this year particularly is going to be a large gathering. We normally have a function of about 200 to 300 people, but we expect this year to be about 500 to 600, because a lot of those who left here are coming back for the reunion from the States, from Canada, some from Israel, and one or two from South America. It's going to be a big event. And after that, the following day and the day after, some of us are going to Israel, actually.
When is this?
This is the beginning of May. Our event here is the 30th of April.
Because of the Warsaw uprising? Yeah.
No, that was, we normally have a reunion nearest to the 8th of May, the nearest Sunday if possible, because that was the time of liberation. So this time is the 30th of April. And then the 2nd and 3rd of May, some of us are going to Israel, because there are events going on there, and we'll probably meet a lot of people from different countries. So in a way, it's a celebration.
Let me ask this. On the day, which is the 27th, which is the liberation of Auschwitz camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau camp,
yeah.
What will you do? Will you watch it on television?
Well, I will, and I think I did mention to you that on the 29th, there's going to be a large gathering at the Logan Hall in Bedford Way. We're hoping to get 1,000 people to come to this commemoration. They have invited the Russian general, his name is Petrenko, to come over. He's 82 now, an old man, but he was the only general who was involved with the liberation of Auschwitz. So he's going to be here. Lord Bullock is going to introduce it. They're going to show a film called Blueprint to Genocide. There's going to be some poetry recited and some prayers, and Rabbi Hugo Green is going to talk as well. So it should be a memorable occasion and an important one.
Now, Victor, you're an Auschwitz survivor. I'm curious, well, I suppose again I probably know the answer to it, but when you must know other Auschwitz survivors, that when you meet one doesn't talk about it, I suppose, does one?
No, we don't talk about Auschwitz. We don't talk about, but some of my colleagues were together in certain camps, yeah, like a camp called Schlieben, Buchenwald, and also prior to that they were working in a ghetto as well. So they often sit down and talk about days gone by, yeah.
But it's not something Auschwitz survivors do among themselves.
To be honest, there isn't a lot to talk about Auschwitz. The time that I've spent there, I didn't do any work. I walked about most of the time like a zombie, you know, trying to keep my uniform, which I had, which looked like striped pajamas, clean. And there was nothing to do. There was no recreation, no work. People were just disinterested in anything. In my case, my instinct was to fight for survival, to try and survive it all. So really, there was no life there. We were like animals. There was nothing to do. There was nothing to read. No libraries. I mean, you can imagine.
From what you heard, do you think the Poles are commemorating it in the right way?
I have actually read that they have been very badly disorganized about it all, not inviting the people that they should have done.
Should you have been invited?
I mean, they can't invite all survivors. They can't send out invitations to all survivors. But there are certain important people whom they should have invited, and apparently they didn't. I'm not involved with that, actually. But Jewish communities were disappointed in the organization of it. I have to say, when I was there last year for the Warsaw Ghetto commemoration, that was very well organized. I have no complaints about that. But it seems that they left out a lot of people who should have been invited. And what I think is possibly hurtful, there isn't very, much or practically nothing, I understand, to signify that the Jews died there. And we have to remember that out of over the 2 million, probably about 95% were Jewish victims. You know, I say Polish people died there as well. Quite a few thousand. But in proportion, it was mainly the Jews who perished. And I think there should be more about that, really. It should be told.
Just, it's almost a final question, but had you had a personal invitation to go, would you have gone?
I wouldn't have, because I did my pilgrimage last year, and I have no intention to go there again. I wouldn't feel comfortable. They asked me, do I want to go back to the place where I was born? I was in Czechoslovakia 3 years ago. I did a trip through Hungary, Budapest, Bratislava, Prague. I could have gone, but the truth is that I have no desire to go. I'll tell you why. There is nothing left there for me to see. This colleague that I mentioned who lives now in Israel, he went last year. He came back saying there are no Jewish houses left. There's no synagogue left. The only possible reminder would be the cemetery, which is probably overgrown. Now, I have no friends there. What am I going to go for? Let me tell you that out of the whole community in that area, and I'm talking about dozens and dozens of villages, there is not one Jew left in that area, not one. I'm told there's probably about 3 or 4 in the town of Kust, which is a big town. But out of all those villages, and I'm talking about thousands and thousands of Jews, there is not one left. So what do I go for?
Have you any idea? I mean, there are supposed to be, I think, 10,000 living survivors of Auschwitz. Have you any idea how many would go back for the commemoration next week?
I have no idea. I don't know.
Okay, Victor, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I can ask some of the basic questions. Have you ever been back?
No, I've never been back.
Why not?
I can't trust myself to go back because I don't think I'll make it back, because it brings back terrible memories. I've left my family there, and I've suffered there, and I don't think I could make it back. I'd love to go, but to light a candle, but I can't bring myself to go. I just can't.
You must have thought long and hard.
I did, and my brother told me as well. He said, he begged me not to go back. He said, I don't know, he was not in Auschwitz, but he says, don't go back because you don't know what's going. He says, you might never make it back. No, I'm under the same impression. I would never come back.
What do you mean?
I'd get a heart attack and wouldn't come back, because you live with it for many years. I couldn't speak about it. And when the denial of the Holocaust came along, and people tried to whitewash it and say it never happened, then I was asked to go to a school, and I lectured for an hour to young children. And from then on, for the first 25 years, I couldn't, even my own children didn't know about it.
You didn't tell them?
I didn't tell him. And funny enough, my son is now 29, and I've made a tape for the Imperial Museum, and he phoned the Imperial Museum, and he wanted to borrow the tapes to find out what I went through. He didn't know whether to approach me and ask me about it, because I spoke to him about it. He says, well, he never told me about it, and I didn't know what to do. So I wanted to hire or borrow the tapes to find out what really happened.
You hadn't told him at all?
No. They knew I'm a survivor of the Holocaust, but they didn't press me, and I did not tell him.
What thoughts go through your head, when you see, for example, all that's on television of late, and what will happen next week?
The thoughts that go through my mind is, the terrible things happened. I've seen some of them happen where I was. I've seen some films, and we live with it. I live with it for many, many years. I get dreams. I dream mostly the same dream, like I'm being chased, and my wife wakes me up, because I dream I'm standing on a corner, and suddenly a black uniform chases me, and I just can't move, and I go and I start shouting, and my wife wakes me up. But they're getting very infrequent now, the dreams. But you live with it, you don't forget it. It's a thing that you forget. You remember every corner where you've been in prison.
How old were you when you went to Auschwitz?
I was 12 and a half. This number was made when I was 12 and a half. We were chosen, 19 boys, to be experimented on. We found that out later on in the camp. And then they took 8 away. I think there's one more survivor. Of the 19, there's one more survivor. But you live with it. It's a thing that you live with. But when people trying to distort it and say it never happened, well, I was there. I don't know how long we'll live, but I'm still a survivor, and I'm a witness to the atrocities that happened.
Does it worry you that, you know, when there are no more survivors?
It does, because it doesn't matter if it happened to the Jews, it happened to the Gypsies, it happened to the unfortunate people that weren't completely looking right. They were brought there as well and gassed from Germany and from any other country, from madhouses. All the people were brought and gassed. But it happened to the Gypsies. I saw whole families being taken. They told them they're going away on a transport, and they were taken one morning on foot and marched back 4 miles to the Birkenau, to the gas chambers. So I don't know why this happened, because we just live from hour to hour. It's indescribable how we live.
Obviously, I mean, a lot of the people who survive now were children at the time, including yourself. But I mean, in terms of, do you worry the story will get distorted when, you know, there are no more like you left to tell the story?
I am. I'm very worried about it, because it's not being taught in the schools. It's not being taught even in Germany. It's not being taught. People go to Germany, and they went. I heard of somebody, a friend of mine, went to Düsseldorf or some other place. He wanted to go to Bergen-Belsen. Well, he was in the town, and he was around the corner, and he asked a woman who was sweeping up, "Where's the camp? Can you tell me doing camp in German?" I said, "Camp? What camp? We don't know anything about the camp." And it was just around the corner. Then he called a taxi driver, took him round the corner, and there was the camp. So they're trying to push it under the carpet. That's not right.
What effect does it have on you when you see film of Auschwitz?
I get very hurt. I get very hurt. It keeps flooding back. Memories come flooding back.
Do you switch the television off?
Sometimes I do. I completely switch it off. I don't want to see it. But sometimes I'm curious. Maybe I'll find out why it happened. I can't get to the bottom of it. I've read so much. And I talk to people, clerical people, and I just can't understand it. Nobody seems to have an answer why this happened. As I've read in the book, which amused me very much, a man wrote, I don't know whether it was the Italian, and he wrote, well, today it was the Jews, and tomorrow it's going to be the bicycle riders. So he says, why the bicycle riders? So he said, why the Jews? And this is the answer you get. But many people today, the younger generation, I call the 40-year-olds, they don't know nothing about it. Many people don't know a thing what happened. And this actually happened. I saw it happening. I was there.
Does it make you angry that people don't?
It does make me angry. People don't want to know. They shut their eyes. They're like, most of the people are like ostriches. They just don't care. As long as it doesn't touch them, they don't care. But it touched us. We're marked for life. All my generation and the generation after me, the older generation. Well, I was just 15 when the war ended. And it touched us very much. And when people say, well, you must have forgotten, you're a youngster, it's not true. We haven't forgotten. It's every day. I live with it, day and night.
Listen, I don't want to distress you too much.
No, I'm not distressed.
But can I take you back to when you first went to the camp? I mean, were you aware there's a camp so close to where you lived?
No, that was the funny part of it. We were taken on civilian trains. We were marked off as we walked into the ramp, like that, marked off. And then within an hour, I was in the concentration camp. I went through the big gate. That every time they show the Auschwitz, they show you that gate and the platform. And we were sitting, getting off on the left-hand side of the platform, and there was a chimney about 200 meters away. It was burning, a square chimney. And I remember that. I knew we were going to get killed, but I didn't know how they're going to do it. I knew something is going to happen there. Because where did they take all these people, elderly people and children? Where did they take them? I know they took young people to work, but I knew something was going to happen. And then I saw a man in glasses, which I thought he was a doctor. He was a doctor. And gold-rimmed glasses, stood on a box and started choosing people out. And he waved to me. I had my hands in my pocket. He said, "You come over here," in German. So I went over. He says, "Take your hands out of your pocket." And he chose me. He asked me all kinds of questions about my health and how old I was. Of course, I said I was older. And he told me to go stand over there. And as my brother stood not far away in the crowd, and he didn't want to move closer. And my little sister was taken on a lorry. She was given a baby to hold. And they took her on white steps. I saw her going up on the lorry, on wooden steps. That went straight to the gas chambers. And we were told to turn right and march off. As we were marching away, boys that weren't chosen ran towards us. So that sergeant, which I remember, got hold of my collar and he wanted to chuck me back because they didn't know who was chosen and who wasn't, because a load of came over running towards us. So this doctor turned round and he said, "No, he was chosen." So he put me back and we marched off. We marched off in twos. We marched into Auschwitz 1. That was about three miles away. We marched there, and we came in after roll call, right after they were dispersing from roll call, and there was 12 people hanging outside the kitchen. There was a garden commando, and then the reality came to me that this is not a nice place. It's not just a working place, but they want to kill us.
How many members of your family were with you?
My sister and my brother were with me. My mother was caught 2 days before. And she went the same way to Auschwitz. Because I found out later.
Hang on a second. Okay. So this is late 42.
Yes. And we were taken between block 1 and 2 was the showers. And we got a cold shower. And we had to run. It was about 7 o'clock in the evening. It was just getting dark, very dark. And we had to run naked in the winter to block 28. The sick bay block. And that's where we were stationed for the beginning. And I couldn't understand. We were fed white bread and margarine, and sometimes we had macaroni and milk. And the dead were being put underneath in the house, underneath. Every day there was 60, 70 dead. I just couldn't understand it. What are we here for? If we're being fed like this, why are these people dead? So one day on the between floors, I stopped a male nurse and I begged him to tell me why I'm here. What's going to happen? Because we weren't working. We weren't going out of the house either. So I gave him some cigarettes, I scrounged. And he said, he made me swear on my mother's life. My mother was killed a couple of weeks before. And he told me, "You're here to be experimented on." So I didn't even know what that meant. So he explained to me what they do, and I started crying. He said, "Don't cry because we'll both be in trouble. Don't make any noise." So I said, "What can I do?" He said, "Get a job. But to get out of this block." So I went down to the doorman. It was a German. He was a criminal. He had a green triangle. And I said, don't you need a runner, a messenger boy? He said, yes. So I went out the house and I showed him how I can run. And he said, right, what's your name? Your Christian name. So I said, Yuda. He said, we can't have that. And he went in, he took out my paper, my registration, and he changed it to Emil. And that's the name stuck with me. And I was messenger there for a while, and I used to go opposite to a block where there were women. There was only one block, number 10, and there were Slovakian women. I saw what happens to them. They were taking blood off them often. I think it was every week, or every second week. I knew they were taking. I saw it. And the doctor was a Jewish woman from Krakow, and she had a small son with her. He was about 6 or 7, and I played with him. And one day I forgot to get out of the block because they were locked in. Before the counting, they were locked in, and I was locked in. Of course, I was missing in my block. So the SS come over, and I had to show my face that I'm there through the window, and he saw me. And I spent the night in that block 10 with the women and with that boy. And I was a messenger boy there for a while. Then I went out and got a job on the building site. We're collecting bricks and all kinds of things, wood and stuff. There were so many factories, and we were all worked by slave labor. And the camp where we were, I think there must have been about over 500,000 people in the camp, because we slept on 3-tier bunks, and it took over an hour for them to march into the orchestra. But your life wasn't your own. You could walk in from work, and the orchestra's playing on the right, the orchestra's playing behind the kitchen, and there's a lorry standing behind block 24 on your left. And just past the block, there's a lorry with a tarpaulin with the back open. And there's 2 Nazis standing there with sticks and prodding people's legs, because the water that we drank was impure. It wasn't purified properly. And people had swollen legs, and they looked like they're healthy, but they weren't. And they prod the leg, and if a white mark came out, he said, on the lorry. And one night he looked at me and he said, come here, put your trouser leg up. He prodded me with a stick. He didn't like the look of me because we just walked in from work. Don't forget, we were out 12 hours. All we had was a drop of soup, and it's freezing. And he said, on the lorry. So I knew that what it meant. We knew right away. So I didn't go on the lorry. I ran around the lorry. So he said in German, you cheeky devil. He said in German, du freche Kerl, go and hau up. Run back to your block. And he let me go. And I ran back to my block. You had to live by instinct. Luck had nothing to do with it. You had to live by instinct. You had to decide what you're going to do. And on the spur of the moment, you had to decide and do it. Otherwise, you were lost. Now, if I would have gone to the lorry, they went straight to the gas chambers without getting their soup in the evening, or bread, or anything else. That was one instant. There was another incident, the end of 44, like August, September 44, the commandant went on holiday. But the man who takes the report, he was an officer, to see that everybody's in the camp, that all the numbers tally. He said, all Jews out. He said it very loud, and all the commanders repeated it. And we all had to come down to the shower rooms, where the showers were. And we had to get undressed, and he was standing there selecting people. Sergeants and SS guards with sticks, and he was selecting people which were weak. He looked at them, And he said, right, left, right, left. Left meant to go in there and get the rest. We were taken up to block number 8 in Auschwitz. You'll see it, it's a museum now. And we were put in the attic, and we waited for 2 days. They had no transport to take us, because many couldn't walk, they could hardly walk. We never got any food. And we're sitting in an attic, in the dark, on rafters, no floorboard, and on rafters. And we're waiting. I heard them discuss it. They're waiting for the lorries. Their lorries used to run on wood. They made a terrible noise and stink. The smoke was going very high and very slow. 2 days later, about 10 o'clock in the morning, I heard a noise, a terrible noise. And I knew the lorries were coming, because I heard them before. So I said to them, one of the guards, Nazi guards, "Can I go to the toilet?" He said, "Yes." So I went down between floors, and I opened the window and I jumped. And there were stones down there, beach stones, big ones. And I got up and I ran. He was shouting like mad. I didn't look back, I ran. I ran back to block where I was 18. And the man who was in charge of the room recognized me. And he said, "Well, the only thing to do is, if they come for you, you'll have to give yourself up, because we can't hide you." He said, "But hide now, don't go out to work." And they gave me a portion of soup, because I haven't eaten for 2 or 3 days, 2 days. And I hid for 2 days there. But these people were loaded on the lorries, he told me, and they were taken away to the gas chambers. The people that were sitting in the attic. And after 2 days, I went out back to work. So I get my rations back. And that's how we lived. We lived from hour to hour. I didn't shave, I was a youngster, but other people, they looked terrible. The elder people, they came from all over the world. They were from everywhere. They were from Belgium. People had enough. They went on the wires. In the morning you could see them on the electric wires, hanging from the electric wires with their hands. They just went to get killed. They've had enough. They gave up. Especially the Belgian people. I don't know why there were so many deaths. They came in 1944. They were hiding before, they told us, in Belgium, until somebody gave them away, so they were arrested. And they only wanted to know what happens to their families. Well, we had to tell them the truth, what happened. And there were deaths every day, and by, I think it was beginning of January, middle of January, we were told everybody out, because they let the rumor go that they mined everything underneath. The sewers are mined, and they're going to blow it up because the Russians are coming. So we got assembled block by block, and we went to the gate, and we got a loaf of bread thrown at us from a lorry. And 6 abreast we marched in the winter. And I think it was 30 below freezing then, the day we marched out. And we marched up towards, not Czechoslovakia, but Germany, into Gross-Rosen. We marched up Poland and then turned left into Gross-Rosen. And there we were met by criminals. We marched for 3 weeks non-stop. We didn't rest, and many died on the way. I was carrying a Nazi's rifle. He couldn't carry it anymore, he was an old man. So he took out the breech and hung the rifle on me. But when the motorbike with the sidecar appeared, coming close, he took it off me, put the breech in and carried it. But one day he complained that he can't walk anymore, and they had a row. So the young SS stood up and he said, go down the field there. And he sat down in the field and he shot him. He shot him with his own rifle. And they took the rifle, went down and took his belt away and left him lying there. But there were, I think there were Silesians. They came along with horse and carts, and they collected these people. The Nazis gave them some vodka, bottles of vodka, and they collected them and buried them in the ravines as you go along by the road. They buried them there. And we marched into Gross-Rosen. We were, met, as I told you, met by criminals. They all had green, we always looked at that, the number and the green, and they counted us. And I got hit on the head with a pickaxe handle, which it flattened my head. You can still see it today. And we were put into barracks, no windows, no doors. Some old straw was there, somebody was there before. And that's where I met my brother, in this camp. I met my brother.
He had survived.
He survived another march from Blechhammer, from another camp, from a civilian camp. Well, he was taken away just to register 2 years before. Just to register his name, my mother was told. And we've never seen him till that day when I saw him in the camp. I didn't recognize him at all. Till a boy from my town said, "That is your brother." And he brought an old man standing in front of me. And it couldn't have been my brother because my brother was only 20 years old. But I looked close in his eye and he called me by a nickname. And I recognized him, my brother. He hasn't eaten for 6 weeks. They lived on leaves. If there was an air raid, they used to run into the fields like we did and grab any grass or sugar beets were growing there. And we used to steal them and eat it as it was, raw. That's how we survived the march. But we didn't get any rest. And both sides of my legs were grown together. I couldn't walk anymore. I walked like a robot, but I still walked. But I think from my transport, there was about 400 left. The rest were shot on the way because they couldn't walk anymore. They said, "Sit down, can't walk, sit down."
Can I ask you what you'll do next week? Will you watch the commemoration services?
I will watch him, yes. I will watch him, but I went to Israel with my brother. In 1975 was a gathering of the Holocaust survivors. And I went into the place which it's called Yad Vashem. They have an exhibition. And I worked halfway through the exhibition and my brother took me out. He says, I was getting very irritated and, and he took me out halfway. He said, "You've had enough," and he took me out. He wouldn't let me see anymore. I've met a lot of survivors. My town survivors were shot at a later date in Buchenwald. We tried to keep together, but in the beginning it was impossible because he came with a different transport and I walked with a different transport. But in Buchenwald we tried to keep together. We arrived there and there's over 500,000 people standing and you couldn't get into the camp until you had a shower and had been disinfected. And it's freezing.
Yeah.
There's nothing to eat, no water. But they saw there were communist prisoners there.
Yeah.
And they saw youngsters, us. And they took us out and disinfected us first and gave us showers first. So I begged them to take my brother and he took my brother with me. And we were sent to the 23rd block, which were mostly youngsters. And we didn't work there because there was no work, because the Americans were coming closer. And one day again, we hear the shout, "Sämtliche Juden antreten." All the Jews come to the what's the name? Come out on the front. Again, they took us into a where they cut wood. And they kept us all there, and they took out groups of 400 at a time in Buchenwald. And we could hear machine gun fire. Well, we didn't take any notice of it, but they came back, the same Nazis came back, the SS. And they took out another group of 400. As you see, I'm very emotional. But I wasn't like that when I was 12 and 13 and 14. You had to be hard. I was very hard. I've learned to be hard. We were seasoned to be very hard, because you learn that in life.
You wouldn't have survived if you hadn't been.
Oh no, far from it. I would have been tread on, because even at work, if you didn't do things with the prisoners kill you. They'll take away what you got, and they'll kill for your shoes. They'll kill you, and you had to be on the up and up. Otherwise, you wouldn't have survived. Because, let's face it, they were in trouble as well. But there was no harmony between us. They hated us because they said this camp was made for Jews. They were brought there by accident. They're supposed to sit in prison, they're sentenced and get out. And he said they were brought in. Some of them told me that. Poles told me this. They said, we were brought in because you Jews are here, and we had to suffer because of you. This I was told a few times.
Who did you leave behind?
I left behind my whole family except for one brother.
How
My
many
mother was
people?
taken, that I knew, immediate people from
No.
about 165 of my family, which I knew personally. in my town.
165?
Yes. My uncles, aunts, cousins, distant cousins, my grandfather's brother and his families. I knew a lot of people from my family because we always used together.
Your immediate family?
My immediate family was left as well. My father died before the war in 1934. But one brother, a sister, and my mum went to the gas chambers. My mother went 2 days before. She went on a Tuesday, and Wednesday was quiet, and Thursday they come again, and they got me, my brother, and my sister. That's how I got in Auschwitz. With my little sister, she was 8 years old, and my brother was 2 years older than I was. Unfortunately, he wasn't chosen, and my sister went straight away. They gave her a baby to hold. She went up on the wooden steps on that lorry, and the scenes that I've seen, I can't explain. It's impossible in a short while to explain what I saw. But my hair went white. The next day, I saw I had grey hair. My hair was cut.
You were 12 and a half?
Yes, my hair went white overnight. What I saw a heap of children lying, and like fish, their mouth went open. They couldn't cry. They didn't cry anymore. There was no voice. I saw that.
Were they dead?
They weren't dead. They were alive. Their mouth was going like a fish, you know. They couldn't cry anymore. They couldn't. They were like, there was no voice anymore. Heap of it. And I saw people being beaten and tread on. And I've never been to war or saw a war film like this, but it was reality. I saw bayonets put into people, and blood was coming out. This I saw one late afternoon. And after that, I was chosen to go into the camp by this doctor in the gold-rimmed glasses. And you had to live in the camp by your wits as well. You had to be very diligent and watchful every minute of the day. Because I saw a German drive up once on a motorbike, and he didn't like the look of a boy, and he told him, get on the back. So the boy thought he's taking him for a ride, to give him a ride back around. He took him to Birkenau, 4 miles away to the gas chambers. He never came back. We never seen him again.
When you lost your last brother recently, didn't you?
Yes, 2 weeks ago, my brother died.
When the two of you, he didn't go to Auschwitz, did he?
No, he wouldn't go. He also said to me, don't go. He begged me not to go. And to his memory, I wouldn't go. Because now I know that if I go back and see all this, because I know the camp, I can close my eyes and I know every block. I know every barrack what it was.
Really?
I can remember every barrack, and I even remember when they built a swimming pool overnight. There's a swimming pool in Auschwitz. You see it in the middle of the camp, the back of the camp, the back of the entrance. You go to the back of the fence and you see it in the middle of the camp, on the back fence, as a swimming pool was made. In 48 hours, they built a swimming pool because the Red Cross was coming. And they set people on the swimming pool, they set them around with cigarettes, under parasols, drinking tea, Russian tea, smoking cigarettes. And the Red Cross came in and saw them, spoke a few words to them, and walked out and walked away. That was it. For that, they built a swimming pool. And there was a Czechoslovakian, I'll never forget his face. I remember all faces. If you show me a picture of him, I'll remember him. He was diving from the top. He was a Czechoslovakian diver. A fantastic swimmer. And he kept diving, and others as well. He chose a team. And this was done for a few minutes.
Just to con the Red Cross?
Yes, and they did. Because they came in, and the people, I spoke to one of the Jewish men, they were all from Vienna. They chose a team that speaks German. They're all Viennese actors, and they were sitting there. They told them, smoke the cigarettes and eat what there is, but don't talk to anybody unless you ask the question, and don't forget we're watching you. And they were watched. There were Germans dressed as prisoners sitting there, so they won't say anything out the way.
Just so I understand, it seems amazing to me, it's 50 years ago.
Yes, and I remember every word, and I remember every move. I remember every person's face.
And you remember the camp?
And I remember the camp. I close my eyes and I can remember the whole camp. Every nook and cranny, I remember. I'll tell you where the bricklayers' school was. I can take you to every block and show you where it was. I'll tell you when my clothes was hung up with my number on it, with my number of the arm, when my clothes was hanging in a sack. It was hung up there on the 27th block.
What was your number?
I've got my number, 125-432. It's my criminal number. I was a criminal. I was told I was a communist. 2 weeks later, I was called and a triangle was made on my arm. And I was told I was a communist. So I asked what a communist was, because I only went 2 years to school. So they all had a laugh. They laughed. They couldn't stop laughing. Because I didn't know what a communist was. I was only 12 years old.
If you remember the camp in all that detail, I mean, the most horrific moment, I suppose, for you would have been, I suppose, seeing your sister the last time.
Yeah. I remember my little sister looking at me. She was with a school girlfriend. And as we didn't say much to one another because there wasn't much to say. But we stood there and looked at one another. She was a lovely little girl with curly hair. And with a school girlfriend, she was standing there. And somebody, a woman or a man, they thrust a baby in her arms to hold it, and her girlfriend as well. And they took their babies up on the steps into the back of that open lorry. But I knew something was going to happen, but I didn't know what. And it was so sudden. The men they had to walk. And we walked off, and there was this doctor in golden glasses standing on a box, choosing people, calling up. And I was one that we called. I was about the 7th, I think, he called.
Why did they pick you?
I don't know. I stood there with my hands in my pocket. And he just looked at me and he said, waved like that, come here. Very sharp. So I went near him. And he asked me, were you ever as yellow as the Star of David? I had the Star of David here. You there? I said, no. Show me your hands. I showed him my hands. He said, stand over there. So I went to the other 7. And I showed my brother, come nearer, come nearer. And he wouldn't. He was frightened to come nearer. He was older than I was. He was 2 years older than I was. Yeah. And then there was the fiasco with I was nearly thrown back. It was just an instinct.
Okay.
That I'm here. It's just coincidence that I'm here. That the German turned around, the doctor turned around, and he saw me, the sergeant was holding me by the collar to toss me back, because there were so many run towards us.
Okay, just a final few questions. Is it important that Auschwitz is remembered?
Yes. I think it's very important that Auschwitz is remembered, because it can happen to my other race. It can happen to another nation. Where it's happening, things are happening slowly. They're happening now in the world. If you look around what's happening, nations are being prosecuted for their religion. It's happening again on a smaller scale. So it's very vital it should be remembered. The innocent children, I understand if you fight soldiers, okay, you were a soldier, you take your chances, you get shot, you get killed. But innocent children, elderly people, they've done nothing to anybody. They didn't ask for anything from anybody. They minded their own business. They were rounded up worse than sheep. There are people defending sheep here today, which is a very nice thing to do. And they were rounded up. We were rounded up like sheep and taken to gas chambers, which we never dreamt of. A civilized race will do a thing like that to other people, to other human beings. Or as we were classed to them as unmentioned, not people. That's what we were classed. But they were human beings. They were breathing air. They were learning in school. My little sister just wanted to learn. That's all she wanted to know. She was so hungry for knowledge.
She was just 8.
And she was just 8 years old. But this should never, never happen again to anybody. I don't wish it on anybody. I don't carry hate, but I can't forgive. I don't hate the Germans, but I can't forgive them. I just can't forgive.
Have you ever even been back to Poland?
No, I wouldn't. That, to me, where I come from, is a very, very bad memory of the Poles as well. They were, I told you before, we were going on trains and people jumped. The Nazis were sitting on top with guns. And whoever survived, he wasn't shot. The Poles picked him up and gave him to the Germans for a pound of sugar or for anything. They just hated us. And I don't know to this day why. All of them, they hated us. And I don't know why, I just can't find out.
Well, thank you very much.
Done it?
Okay. Well, I'll ask you some of the general questions. So that's your keenness in terms of getting across. I mean, we're here, 50 years on. Why is it important that the story is told?
Well, because I think it is the most outrageous story, really, in history. You know, this was a genocide of a size which is totally incomprehensible, even for us who've been witnesses there. But I think it's terribly important to point out why it was different from any other genocide. Because this was directed against totally defenseless people. It was not a territorial problem, it was not a religious problem, it was the annihilation of an entire people. And I think it's very important to remember that, because it concerns everybody, it doesn't just concern Jews.
You yourself have told your own story more than once, I assume.
Yes.
Do you feel like the story has been neglected?
I don't think that my own story is terribly important. One seems to need it because I can quite understand that the Holocaust is such a huge concept that you need actually individual stories to identify, so that you can translate it into your own life somehow. That's why I think it is important that people tell their stories. But, you know, we all have terrible stories to tell. And one is as bad as the other. So it's almost, to me, it's almost a slight embarrassment to tell my own story, but I can understand that for you it's important, because then you can identify with a 16, 17-year-old girl. I mean, if you just want to know how I actually got into Auschwitz, I lived in Breslau. We were a totally normal family. My father was a lawyer. We had 3 children. A very nice, comfortable life, I remember, very happy home. Then 33 arrived. Bit by bit, one realized, because I was very young then, but I realized somehow in the background things are not as they should be. And then you notice that your people disappeared, people emigrated. There was a lot of talk. It was beginning to be uncomfortable. And slowly, slowly, it was like a closing in of the wall. Slowly, slowly, things became, well, I mean, you just knew that things were very bad. And then tremendous efforts of emigrating. My father was a lawyer, which is a very unfortunate profession to emigrate with. And he was procrastinating and thinking, you know, the Germans can't be that stupid, you know, the usual story. And like always in these cases, when a lot of people want to emigrate, you find that the country's frontiers close, you know, who wants a whole lot of refugees? So we missed the boat, just to make it short, we missed the boat, we stayed. Eventually my parents were deported. My sister, I have an elder sister who went to England. Last minute she got out. My sister and I stayed behind because we were working in a factory making toilet paper, and that seemed to be we were indispensable making toilet paper, so we weren't on this particular transport. But we were quite bolshy children, really, and we happened to speak French. I was brought up with 2 languages. There were French prisoners there, and we got into contact with them, and we were asked whether we could help them because we can write the funny German writing, and we still had a typewriter. So we got involved with forging papers for French prisoners, because in those days there were French civilian workers and French prisoners. You know, France had capitulated. So these passes were for French civilian workers. So it was very good, because we didn't even have a language problem, you see what I mean. In fact, Eric Williams, I don't know whether that means anything to you, the wooden horse story.
Yes, it does, yeah.
He used one of these papers. Anyway, this is only by the way, and this was all very, very lucky, because finally we decided we will try and make papers for ourselves and try to escape. It's a laughable story, really, because where do you escape to? But we were very young people, and we thought, well, we've got to get out of here. And France was still only half occupied in those days, and the big idea was to get into the unoccupied zone of France. Looking back now, of course, was a laughable concept, but still, you know, it kept us happy for a bit. But at least we were doing something. You know, the terrible thing was that we were just sitting there waiting for the end, whatever shape that might take. So, right, so we had these papers. We were upholstery workers. I mean, totally ludicrous, really. I didn't even know whether there were female civilian workers. Anyhow, we had a good old try, but we were arrested at the station. And all this turned out to be terribly lucky, really, because we were put in prison and we were criminals, really, because I was a forger. I mean, the indictment was forgery, helping the enemy, and attempted escape. Really quite ludicrous, but anyway. And it was very lucky to be in prison. And we knew that already then, that the longer we are here, the better. Because the general direction was Auschwitz or whatever other camp.
Were you aware of it before you went?
We were aware of it, but you know, the human nature is peculiar. You know, we even heard about the gas chambers and we thought, can't be. But we knew. And we knew more and more because once in prison, although nobody's allowed to talk to anybody, of course, everybody talks to everybody somehow. And some people were sent back from Auschwitz to give evidence in cases, you know. We knew what was going on. So we also knew that the longer we sit in this prison, although it wasn't particularly pleasant, the better. And we had a court case and we were sentenced, but the moment we were sentenced, the Gestapo got hold of you again. You see, there was a sort of a bit of a feud, I think, between the Gestapo and the judiciary. I don't think that some of the judges really agreed with the fact totally that, that Jews should just be sent away. So somehow we were grabbed out of the hands of the Gestapo, had a court case, sat in prison for a year, had the sentence, then the Gestapo got hold of you again. My sister was sent to a penitentiary, I was sent to Auschwitz, and later we met in Auschwitz. So that's how I came to Auschwitz, thank God, a year later than I would have done had I not committed these enormous crimes, you see.
What year was it when you went?
That was in 1943.
And what do you remember about your arrival there?
I remember about my arrival, that we arrived at night. I arrived in a prison train, not in a big transport. We arrived at night and we had to wait till the morning. And I remember a lot of noise. It was noisy, dogs barking, people screaming. And the next day we were taken to the reception block where we had our head shaved and a number tattooed. And this was done by prisoners. The Germans didn't do this, it was done by prisoners. And we obviously talked to each other, where do you come from? Everybody wanted to know the news, how's the war going? Is it not soon over? And somehow I let it out that I played the cello, and that was my next piece of luck. She said, fantastic. Here's an orchestra and we'll try and whatever. So I finished up in this orchestra, which was an enormous piece of luck.
Why?
Because I was the only cellist there. First of all, the orchestra was just being created, so there were most peculiar instruments. I mean, don't think in terms of a normal orchestra. There's mandolins and guitars and some violins. And they didn't have a bass instrument, so, they were very pleased to have me there.
Who was forming the orchestra?
Well, the idea came from the SS. I mean, we had a great champion in the Hessler was I liked the idea, the Mandel, and I don't know whether you're familiar with the names of the commandants there. It was formed by the Germans. They said, we want an orchestra here. And then they looked for people who could play instruments, you see.
Hang on. Is it... yeah.
Pussycat. She likes anything. Sorry.
Okay. Went to... So sorry, I'll ask the question again. Whose idea was there? Whose idea was it to have an orchestra there?
Well, it was the Germans' idea. You see, people always think it was a peculiar thing to have an orchestra in a concentration camp. It wasn't as peculiar as all that, because our job really was to play marches for the commandos that went out. You know that Auschwitz is surrounded by factories, like IG Farben, Buna, and that was the cheap labor. So there were thousands of people marching out every morning and marching back in the evening. And it's much nicer to march to music and much more orderly, because the Germans like order, So we played marches every morning, every night. And otherwise, we were a sort of, the SS would come in after they've been selecting who should live and who should die. It's a bit strenuous work, I suppose. It'd be nice to have a nice tune afterwards. So we were the sort of entertainment, if you see what I mean.
What sort of tunes did you play?
Nothing very, it was, we didn't have any music. So one of the problems was, how do you produce music for a funny collection of instruments like that? We used to get like piano reductions of the current musicals, of the day. And whatever there was, Das weiße Rössel am Wolfgangsee, I remember. Whatever there was, I mean, you wouldn't know about these things anymore. Now, about some things we played Zigeunerweisen, I remember. We played Träumerei, Schumann Träumerei. We had some singers there. I mean, it sounds ludicrous, but...
Was it odd being part of it, given what else was going on?
Pardon?
Was it odd being part... Because even in those circumstances, creating music is a beautiful thing, whatever.
Well, yes, it was odd being part of it, but obviously we were very envied by a lot of other prisoners. You see, a very important thing is that, for instance, it would have been foolish to murder me, because then they wouldn't have had a cello, if you see what I mean. It would have been just foolish. So we leave her there because she's playing the cello. because we haven't got somebody else. If I'd been doing carrying stones, it would have been. You understand what I mean? And that applied to everybody in the orchestra. You know, we were, for the moment, irreplaceable, for the moment. So it was a day-to-day existence, you know. You were damn lucky to be somewhere where possibly you could live to the next day. It's really as basic as that. You know, thinking, it was a luxury to think too much. We are really down to the basics now of, are we going to breathe tomorrow?
What if you'd been a violinist?
Oh, that would have been the same. But I was in the best position because I was the only one. Mind you, if there had been a cellist coming in a week before me, already I probably wouldn't have been talking to you today. You know, life depended totally and 100% on coincidence and luck, and whether you happen to be at the right place at the right time.
Did they provide the cello, presumably?
Yes. There was a cello there. There was very little that wasn't there, because everybody who was picked up and taken to Auschwitz was given a sort of, you can bring a suitcase, you know, if you're going to Auschwitz now, you will see the suitcases there. So everybody grabs, I mean, imagine somebody comes to your house and said, out. You grab everything that is nearest and dearest to you, probably some warm clothes and whatever is the most important thing in your life. So somebody must have had a cello as their most important thing in their life. And I was the one that played on it, because God knows where he was.
How long were you in the orchestra for?
Well, as the Russians approached towards the end of 1944, Auschwitz was being redesigned, as it were. And we were sent westwards. I can't tell you the exact date, but it was November-ish, end of October, beginning of November, 1944.
So you'd been in the orchestra?
Well, almost a year. And I've seen many things whilst I was in the orchestra. What was going on in Auschwitz.
Which one can't forget?
And which one shouldn't forget? Which one shouldn't forget?
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, you know, Auschwitz stands now as the symbol for all concentration camps, because it combined the labor camp and the extermination camp. And there were great big crematoria standing there and great big gas chambers standing there. And you could see the people, as they came off the train, assemble on the ramp and walk slowly into a gas chamber and come out as black smoke. And that was the daily picture that you had in Auschwitz.
And that's what you saw?
That's what you saw, and that's what you knew is going to be you one day. This is how we lived in Auschwitz.
You met your sister again there?
Yeah.
What do you remember about that?
It's another piece of luck I remember about that, because my sister was sent to a penitentiary, and when we said goodbye to each other, we didn't have a hope in hell to see each other again, you know, in this situation. And when I arrived in Auschwitz, and I told you that I was having this conversation about the girl who was shaving me and tattooing me, and she asked me whether I would give her my shoes, because we had to take our clothes off. All this is in a state of nudity, all this was happening. You know, you stand there with no clothes, no hair, looking terrific. And she said to me, give me your shoes, because they're going to be taken away anyway, which I did. And these shoes had a funny history, because they had been dyed black because I spilled something on them. My mother was very cross, and we had to dye them black, and we put red laces on them, and they were recognizable shoes. My sister recognized these shoes. I mean, it's quite a ridiculous coincidence. My whole life is picked with ridiculous coincidences. As I tell them, I wonder whether people believe me, but you can believe me. So my sister recognized these shoes. She said, I know these shoes. Whose shoes? I said, oh, well, there was a girl who came in a week ago. She's in the orchestra. And I said, well, that's my sister. And that's how we got together. I mean, you can't ask for a more crazy situation than that.
Did she survive too?
Yeah. And also partly, well, not partly, but wholly, because she was the sister of the cellist. I mean, I was able to help her. And
How?
I managed to get her a better position because she was in this terrible reception block. I don't know how much you know about Auschwitz, but the first thing you do, you go into quarantine, and quarantine was the most ghastly thing you can think of. And a lot of people didn't come out of quarantine. And she was there, she got more and more ill, and she had typhus, and she was really on the way out. She had great big holes in her legs. You know, if you don't eat, wounds don't heal because you haven't got, it's called avitaminose. I don't know whether there's such a thing in English. And really, I thought she'd be better off dead. She was so ill. So I made a desperate attempt at, I went to the camp commander and said, look, my sister is here, and could she not get perhaps a better job? I mean, my sister speaks a lot of languages, and they always needed interpreters, and there was such a position as a Läuferin, a messenger, which was better than being in wherever. And she was made a messenger. I didn't even think how she could carry messages, but eventually she got better, and anyhow, she's alive today.
Have you ever been back to Auschwitz?
Yes, I've been back twice. I've been back once because the orchestra in which I play had concerts in Warsaw and in Wrocław, which is my hometown now, and a free day in between. So I thought I will take this opportunity, and I hired a car and I went to Auschwitz. That's a number of years ago, but I've just been back now again. And of course, it's a big problem because Birkenau, which is the camp where all the crematoria and the gas chambers were, and where I was, is, you won't see anything there when all the huts are down. The crematoria have been, gas chambers have been blown up. You need a lot of imagination when you go there. But Auschwitz itself, the mother camp, is very well preserved, and it's stone houses, so hopefully it'll remain for people to see. And
is it important that it does?
Very, very important. How can you doubt it? I mean, what happened in Germany and Poland and all around countries is so dangerous. And you know, when we came out of the camps, I was full of, it sounds crazy, but I was full of optimism, thinking that, I mean, this terrible thing has happened, we've survived it, and it'll change the world. People will understand the evil of thinking yourself superior to other people, you know, taking the God-given right that you can dictate who should live and die. I mean, that will be understood, and nothing terrible will ever happen again. Well, we weren't absolutely right, were we? But I must again stress that what happened there is different from a war, because we're totally defenseless people. An arbitrary idea that a whole race should be annihilated. And it's very important that there should be a museum in this country. You know, I do speak to young people, and I mean, I've been speaking in schools, and I get very good questions, and very important questions, and I can see that people actually don't know what's been. Holocaust has become a sort of name, Holocaust, Inquisition. Inquisition is longer ago. Holocaust happened, well, certainly in my lifetime, you know, it's not that long ago. And I think we must, there's one reason perhaps that we have survived, that we must do our bit for the people who are no longer here to talk. You know, the last words of my father to me were, watch your walk, because I walk very badly. And I've since translated that in a way that I should watch the way I walk. You know, I feel very much that at this particular moment, because it's so important, the 50 years, we are being watched by the people, by the souls of the people. What are you doing about us? Or is it all going to be just forgotten? You know, a man like my father, he was a lawyer, he was Never mind, he could have been anything. He's a wonderful person, a normal person. He had to be shoved into a train, driven east. I can't even tell you exactly which day he breathed his last. Had to undress and was shot into a grave. Why? And my mother. And that is 2 people out of millions.
Do you worry then, I mean, when you as the last of the witnesses really, when it comes down, and there are fewer and fewer of you. Okay, it's a 50th anniversary now, which gives, there is a media...
I know. I keep having it rubbed in that how limited my time is.
I didn't mean it like that.
I tend to go on a little while longer if I can, yes.
But, 25 years hence?
Yes, so I do.
Does one worry about then that the story is forgotten?
Yes, absolutely. That's, I think, why we must do everything we can now. But not in a sensational. You see, I'm always afraid, people always want sensations out of you. For instance, I've written my story down. It's very unsensational. A publisher has seen it and it's been rejected. Not that I'm particularly interested in having it published, but other people seem to be interested. It's too short and it's too this, and not enough gore, you see. I'm afraid that people always want to hear some ghastly story to be really interested in. You need a lot of confrontation here. You have to confront also your own attitude to the whole thing. I think that is where we could possibly get something positive out of it. Your own attitude to minorities. If it sets you thinking, the Holocaust sets you, don't regard it as something a sort of thing to look at, something terrible to happen, but it's got nothing to do with me, it's got to do with everybody. Because where does all this terrible hatred of the Jews come from, for instance? Where does it come from? You have to ask yourself. You have to ask yourself lots of questions which are uncomfortable. The whole Holocaust is very uncomfortable. And why is it uncomfortable, really? Because it poses a lot of questions about people's behavior, attitudes to each other, etc.
But people's natural instinct is not to be made uncomfortable. They would
That's
rather
right.
forget about it.
That's why you hear, it drives me crazy, you hear on the television when they're about to show something, it said, must warn you, we'll show some disturbing pictures. Warn you that it might be disturbing. You must know about that. Well, I find that totally unacceptable. You should be disturbed. Unless people are disturbed, they're never going to do anything. Don't be disturbed. Everybody keeps in their little... And that is usually about the news. They don't ever warn you about, when they show the most ghastly things in, whatever plays there are on. Not plays, but, police stories or something. But when it comes to news and real things, we must warn you, the pictures might be disturbing. Well, be disturbed.
What was your reaction when this kind of revisionist line was given a fair airing in the last 3 or 4 years?
I was disturbed, extremely disturbed, and very, very furious.
What did you do?
What did I do? Look, I do what I can by talking to people, but the people that I talk to are already the people that are converted, I went to a conference in Hanover and with young German historians. And, I aired my views and encouraged them to do as much as possible about them. What can you do?
Can you just give me your thoughts on what by the time this goes out, this will be later in the week, in fact. Will you watch what happens on the Thursday and the Friday in Krakow and at Auschwitz?
Yeah, closely. I watch everything to do with concentration camps, and I watch everything, and I read. Yes, I watch everything, of course. And you see, a lot of people say, "Oh, I don't know how you can," and you shouldn't. Always as if you didn't look, you won't see it. It's a totally wrong concept to think that if you don't talk about it, it isn't there, and if you don't look at it, it isn't there. for us survivors, it's always there. We don't have to scream about it every day, but it's there. I mean, it's impossible not to be there. It must color your life. We've seen things that normal people don't see. And we made a tremendous effort to normalize ourselves, to be normal people.
Just a final question. I'm curious to know whether you can remember it. When the orchestra went to Poland, did you just take yourself off that day to go and see Auschwitz on your own?
Yes. I took with me a colleague because I always need an umbilical cord to my now life, if you see what I mean. I'm very careful not, for instance, at the moment, I'm very involved, obviously, with interviews, etc. And I'm, at the moment, thank God, working a lot, playing the cello a lot. And I'm very glad about that because it keeps me connected to my life, which is my life, here and now. You have to switch that off now, huh?
You happy? Okay. It's going. What year are we talking about anyway? When you would have gone to see Auschwitz again for the first time?
I think it was in the 70s. Can't remember exactly.
So what exactly did you do?
I just looked at it. I just walked through it. Didn't do anything specific.
On your own?
No, I went with a colleague of mine. In fact, then another colleague joined. We were 3 people. Because I'm always very keen to keep the umbilical cord connected with my life at present.
And did you explain it to them? Did you talk about it to them?
Didn't need any explaining. Altogether, if you go to Auschwitz and look at the museum and look at the heaps of hair, spectacles, shoes, you don't need any explaining. It's all totally self-evident.
Is it more vivid than anywhere else?
Well, it's totally different from Belsen. In Belsen, nothing exists anymore. Belsen had to be burned down because it was totally putrid. And they have a museum there, but there is nothing relating to what there was in Belsen. It's sanitized. It's a museum. It's very good now. The tremendous efforts have been put in there. And it's a place where you can study what's been going on, but nothing original remains in Belsen, whilst original things still remain in Auschwitz.
Is there anything like Auschwitz to remind people?
Anywhere else? I don't know, really. I haven't been to any other camp. I think there are museums in other camps, but no, I can't answer that.
Well, it's just a thought because a colleague of mine had been to Auschwitz, and he said, because I said, I will just film Auschwitz as it is, as it is now, because as far as I can understand, and he confirmed this by going to other camps when he was there 4 or 5 years ago, he said that things were sanitized. Auschwitz was one of the few places where you did get some sense.
Well, there you are. So I'm right, yes. Yes, I'm right. You see, Auschwitz also, so many Poles were killed in Auschwitz, which this young man will confirm, and Gypsies. It wasn't just Jews. Now, Auschwitz certainly has assumed, the sort of biggest camp, but I think one should not forget how many camps there were that one doesn't even know the names of. Neuengamme, Stutthof, I was amazed myself. I have a map at home with dots where there were camps, where people were killed, which one doesn't even know about.
When you speak in schools, how ignorant are people?
Very ignorant, but I don't expect from school children to, they've, funny enough, I just had another phone call from my grandson. Could I come back to his school again? There's another history teacher who wants me to come and speak at their school. They learn about the Holocaust, but who can actually teach the Holocaust? I ask myself. Other than, yes, there was a Holocaust, and it was Hitler and the Germans, and then they did this, that, and the other. Who can actually teach it? Other than people who've actually been there. Well, I think there are a lot of historians now who, Dr. Cesarani and people like that, who of course made it their business to learn all about the Holocaust, but they're not exactly the people who are going to teach in schools. And I had a young man here interviewing me, 30 years old, who never heard about the Holocaust. He went to school here, never heard about it. That's bad news, I think.
It's shocking for you, I would think.
Yeah. That's why I think a museum is so important.
A museum here?
Here is terribly important.
Why?
Well, so that, you know, when people do go, for instance, to the Imperial War Museum, it is part of history. It shouldn't be brushed under the table.
Is it here?
Well, there isn't one here.
And at the Imperial War Museum, isn't there not anything on the Holocaust?
There's a tiny little bit on the Belsen, because the British liberated Belsen. And that's only been open for a few years. And I mean, I'm glad, there's a beginning now. There is talk about it now, which is very good.
It's a long time coming.
Yeah. And late, because, you know, you've got to grab us whilst we're still around.
Anita, thank you very much.
Okay.
At least now there's still some of us, although we are aging, and we are amongst the youngest of the survivors. We bore witness and we went through it. We can at least explain.
People trying to distort it and say it never happened. Well, I was there. I don't know how long we'll live, but I'm still a survivor, and I'm a witness to the atrocities that happened.
I keep having it rubbed in that how limited my time is.
Didn't mean it like that. Didn't mean it
I
like
tend
that.
to go on a little while
Well,
longer
I
if I
hope so.
can, yes.